The worst thing is when you apply to 20 or 30 places and you just get radio
Nothing.
silence,
Yep.
right? Like you don't get any feedback. Was my resume a problem?
I'll jump in there just because
Yeah.
I can't leave it at that. That networking piece, even from a very, very small interaction with someone, if you have a coffee chat with someone and then a week later you say, "Hey, loved everything you said about the company and what you do," there's a much higher chance that they're going to tell a hiring manager, "Hey, had a conversation with Jane. We should at least bring him in for an interview."
Rather than spamming 100 different positions with your application, you can actually do some legwork. Like in the worst case, you at least get a human to tell you no. I'm here with James Q Quick. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I want to hop right into your story. I want to make this whole episode really just about how you got into tech, and we can kind of reflect on some of the different decisions that you made, and how they affected your career. So, why don't you take just a second and introduce yourselves for those of my audience that have maybe not heard of you yet?
Yeah. So I am almost exactly a year a full-time content creator in the tech, web development, JavaScript space is where I spend the majority of my time. And so that's like kind of seemingly unrelated, but that evolved out of a career in tech. I had a computer science degree. That's what I studied in college. That was actually like on a whim. Like I didn't know what to study and I didn't know anything about it and I just chose it. So here I am now, like 10, 11, 12 years later. So it worked out. But I was applying for jobs in college, I applied at Microsoft, got turned down for a traditional software developer job, got turned down for a TAM role, which is technical account manager. And then they said, "Hey, like you did well enough. What do you think about this other job as a technical evangelist?" Which meant absolutely nothing to me. And especially at that time, that title meant nothing to most people, to be honest. And anyway, what I started my career doing that, and what that became was public speaking and workshops and teaching people and working with developers in the community. And that's what I really fell in love with. So this was the ability to combine like a technical computer science background, a passion for building and learning, and then combining that with the ability to teach other people how to do it and use my social presence and appreciation for being around people to combine all of that stuff. So that was how I got started. And it was really all on a accidental whim of having no idea what to study when I got to college originally.
Okay, most people I've talked to, I've never heard this accidental kind of
Yeah.
stumbling your way into tech before. Almost everyone I talk to has either had some hard pivot or transition into
hmm
tech. Let's rewind a little bit. I want to set the stage. So, what year did you graduate high school?
Graduated high school in 2009 and applied, got into college, and they asked me what to study like that summer before going. And I was like, I computer science because I just don't know. But 2009 was when I graduated high school and then started college.
Okay, 2009. This is like crazy to me. So you show up at college, like computer science is such a weird field unless you like
Yeah.
have some sort of background in programming. Like
hmm
it's not the major that people just randomly pick. Was
Drop
there
into. Yeah.
Yeah, what was going through your head? Did you know that programmers made good money? Did you admire tech companies? What were you thinking?
Neither. I'm like shaking my head as you ask those questions. Neither of those were anything that I considered. In high school, I knew of a computer science class. We had AP computer science, and I was going to take that not because I had an interest in it, not because I like knew what it was to be interested in it, but because other friends were taking it. My senior year of high school, and I was a 4-year orchestra student, and so those classes conflicted. So I stayed with my 4th year of orchestra instead of taking computer science. So that was literally like I had heard of friends of mine like programming their TI-89 calculators or whatever, having no, and it was just magic to me. Like I didn't know anything about what they actually did. And maybe I had heard of that, and then I knew of a computer science class, but that was literally it. And I had applied to college specifically for the engineering school. I don't even remember if that was like a super intentional decision, but I had always been more of a math person. That was just what I was. That was my favorite subject was math. And so I was looking at options inside of engineering, I didn't really want to do a ton of physics. I didn't like chemistry at all, and so it really came down to computer science sounded like it might be interesting, and it didn't immediately have something that I knew I didn't want to do. Was really what it came down to. So I really am truly one of those people who like, sure, this is a thing that I could potentially do, and again, 12, 13 years later, here I am. So obviously it's worked
Yeah.
out, but I had no plan getting into this at all.
So I have a lot of opinions about computer science degrees. I also have a CS degree. I think there's a lot
Yeah.
of great things about going to college, and some not so great things. Um,
Yep.
I tend to think it's a better idea if you were like 18, right?
Hmm.
Like I'm often asked, should I go back to school to get a CS degree? I got a degree in like music or English or something like this. And I think going back is often not the right choice. That's
Yeah.
really expensive, 4 years.
Yep.
But I think for a lot of 18-year-olds, like who need to explore, especially if they have a scholarship and don't need to take on student loans, I think CS degrees can be great. I'm curious, like, what your take is on your whole like CS degree experience. Did you like it? Do you
Yep.
feel like you learned a lot?
Yeah. So a couple of different perspectives. One on the like, it makes sense at 18 to go to college and get a computer science degree. So there's nothing about college that I would ever trade. That was for many different reasons the best time of my life. Like I had an absolute great balance of learned a lot, had a lot of fun, sports were good on campus, like social activity, just everything. I met my wife there, like everything about college I absolutely loved. And that was always like the plan. Like all of my friends were doing traditional, like they're going to college and I was in that boat. So that was never really kind of a debate at the time. And I was super fortunate where I didn't come from much money and Vanderbilt matched 100% of demonstrated need. So I actually like every year got like 1,000 or 2 grand back from grants that I had gotten. So I didn't pay
Nice.
anything to go to
Yeah.
like one of the most expensive universities in the country. And so from that perspective, again, like I certainly wouldn't trade an amazing experience and not have to pay anything for it. Like that's like the ideal situation. So when I think about like my computer science degree, there was all the basic classes, if people are familiar with degrees that you could probably think of, like a CS 101 intro to programming. There was data structures and algorithms, which is one of those like really intimidating hot topics for people looking to break into tech, that they're scared of those type of whiteboarding interviews. And they're actually like not as common as a lot of people fear they are, which is really interesting. But I had that. I had all the kind of basic stuff that you'd expect, which is very, very different from what people would learn in a boot camp. Because some people may be shocked to know I didn't learn JavaScript in college at all. I didn't
Yeah.
really learn anything about web development. I didn't learn anything about GitHub, which might blow your mind. I didn't know like a bunch of more modern tools, to be honest. And like those have become like more mainstream since 2009 to 13. But I I learned the fundamentals of literal computer science and not like how to go out and be a developer in the real world. And I think that was a big miss. But the one additional caveat I'll add is like going into interviews in my senior year, I was asked like relatively basic questions that I definitively should have known the answer to. Explain these concepts of object oriented programming. Again, something that's definitely covered in computer science degree versus not as much in a boot camp. And I bombed. I couldn't explain basic questions about that. And so I look back at that and I treated college like it was school. Like I got good grades, but I didn't use that as a reason to really learn what was going on. I used it as a reason to try to hack my way into getting the A or just like getting good grades. And so looking back on it, like I didn't get out of it what I could have and or should have had I approached it in a different way. And I think there's some combination of that of like the content just wasn't as modern or as applicable in a lot of ways as it could be, as it could have been. And I think that's the advantage that a lot of boot camp grads have. You're thrown into this whirlwind of like 6 months or however long of a program. You're not going to know all the things that you've been taught by any means, but the stuff that you're taught, like you can immediately go out on your side and like you could do a freelance project to build a website for someone. It's not going to be like that great. It's not going to be the best thing. It's not going to look the best. It's not going to have like, all these things, but you could go out and do that. And I had no ability to do that when I graduated. So I think to your point, going back to school after you've already been like either you have a degree or you never got one, but you're several years removed, I don't think that makes sense because of how accessible it is through boot camps and as a content creator, like through other content, whether it's free or paid, you can learn everything that you need to get a first job and a super successful career as a developer. And I see that with communities that I'm in and having taught myself, I see that story play out over and over and over again. So I'm in the same boat as you. I wouldn't recommend people go back to school. I would say find resources and boot camps and communities that you can get involved in and leverage those to get to that first job much faster than you would doing a traditional 4-year degree.
Yeah, my observation has been that, like, in the boot camp scene, you learn a ton of tools that are really applicable to, like, modern
Hmm.
programming, right? You'll learn how to use GitHub, you'll learn how to Git push. I actually graduated, from college basically not knowing what Git was, which is
Yeah, no, I
kind of
literally knew
crazy.
nothing. Yeah,
Like,
it
I went to
is.
school in 2013, like, Git was a
Yep.
big thing, GitHub was there, um,
Hmm.
but, like, my professors, they were great, but, like, they didn't teach us any of these modern tools, like, they're
Yep.
using, like, Emacs and editing text on the screen, but, like, that was kind of the end of the
Hmm.
tooling, and I wasn't using Emacs, like, I was just expected to find an editor I liked. I started in Notepad. I have this kind of if you're going the boot camp or the self-taught route, I think you need to err on the side of going a little deeper on
Yep.
fundamentals and theory, because that's the kind of stuff
Hmm.
that you'll tend to miss.
Yep.
And then conversely, if you are in a CS program, I think you need to err on the side of going out and finding the modern
Practicality.
tools.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yep.
love your video on, like, the Thunder client. I'm a huge Thunder client user now,
Nice.
in VS Code. But, like, you need both, and I think there's a balance to be struck.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest things I often recommend for people that go through boot camps. Like, you should spend some time doing data structures and algorithms for understanding the concepts, the fundamentals, all those things. But the additional caveat that I'll give to that is primarily people's main goal in going through a boot camp is to get a job, right? Like, that's why most people do.
Yeah.
Some people are just curious, some people have time, and that's great. But like, the vast majority of people are trying to transition to a career in tech and programming. And so when you finish with that, like, you have so much more work to do, but all of that work should be hyper prioritized into what's going to have the biggest benefit and biggest enabler to you getting that first job and then going beyond. And sometimes data structures algorithms is not that. And I kind of want to call this out because I think tons of people graduate or from a computer science degree or a boot camp, and they fear these super technical interviews. And I've done the Google interviews where you whiteboard on or you do challenges on a whiteboard for 8 hours during the day, and people fear that. But it's not as stereotypical as people think. It's not as common as people think. So you can actually be really strategic and do research into what types of interview processes different companies have, and you can stick with the ones that just don't do whiteboarding. Now, depending if there's a company that you want to work for and they do those types of interviews, you absolutely have to be prepared for those. But the biggest piece of advice I have for people is do your research into what types of interviews at what types of companies that you're interested in, and hyper prioritize everything that you do to optimize for that interview and getting your foot in the door. And then beyond that, I don't want to make it sound super easy, but you're kind of golden, right? Like, after that, you're getting hands-on experience by getting paid and doing real world projects. And then you can go from job to job, and your background before that just matters less and less at that point.
Yeah, the second job is 10 times easier to land than the first
Hmm.
one. The first one is so much harder. I love having people like you on so I can get more so I can expose my listeners to more and different opinions about how they should be studying for interviews, because I think all of us have had different inroads into tech
Hmm.
and we have different stories. For example, I was just talking to Melky. He's a Twitch streamer,
Yeah.
streams like Go and Rust.
Hmm.
And his advice was basically that at the larger tech companies, you'll tend to do more of these, like, data structures, algorithms, leak
Hmm.
code type puzzle solving things. And at the smaller
Yep.
companies, it's the projects that tend to help a little bit
Yep.
more. And in my experience, I think that is generally true. Another heuristic is, I think if you're interviewing for more front end oriented roles or like full stack roles at small companies, yeah, you'll tend to need less leak code and data and
Hmm.
algorithmic skills. But on the back end side, a lot of times you will need that, especially if it's
Yep.
like a pure back end position, maybe even like oriented towards a data engineering position at a larger company. I'm curious if you have any other thoughts, or if those are basically your observations as well.
I think I would probably say something similar to that, but I almost don't want to be too prescriptive or give too much advice specifically around that, because that's going to be super dependent upon the individual companies. And I think this is where people miss is they miss the opportunity to take the interview process into their own hands. And what I mean is like doing that research of knowing here's 10 companies I want to work for. Here are 50 different people I can reach out to that work at those companies to say, hey, would you be interested or would you be open to having a coffee chat? I see you work at XYZ company. You do this job. I would love to work for that company. I'd love to learn more about your experience. And you can ask them about their interview experience and or reach out to HR people to do the same thing. And so if you do that, now you come in with so much more control over this process because you know what to expect and you know what to prepare. And so I think everything you said I agree with, like those stereotypes, but that still is not 100% representative of what every individual person is going to see, and different companies can be different. Like I applied for my first software position at Microsoft and never had anything whiteboarding related at all. One thing that annoyed me was they asked me a question of what's the largest amount of lines of code like in a project that you've worked on? And I was like, I have no idea. That's not something I've looked at. And
I
I
never
still to this
counted them.
day,
Yeah.
no, yeah, that's not what we do. We just build stuff. And I still to this day think that was one of the dumbest questions I've ever gotten. But I never had anything like whiteboarding. Like I never had algorithms. I talked about projects that I had built, but I never had whiteboarding. So anyway, like I said, I think it
Yeah.
all is like hyper dependent on the specific situations and companies and roles that people apply for, and they can go out and do that research so that they can get a much more specific answer than I could ever give.
Yeah, I think that's really good. That's a really good perspective, and I really liked what you mentioned about finding specific companies that you're interested in working for, and doing a little bit of legwork to figure out a what the interview process is like, and just to kind of network with the people that might be
Yeah,
involved.
the
And
networking piece is so big. I'll jump in there just because
yeah,
I can't leave it at that. Like the preparing yourself or getting an idea of what to expect to interview is part of that, but that networking piece, even from a very, very small interaction with someone, if you have a coffee chat with someone and then a week later you say, "Hey, loved everything you said about the company and what you do. I just applied for this role." There's no guarantee, but there's a much higher chance that they're going to tell a hiring manager, "Hey, had a conversation with James. Don't know much about him, but he seemed really excited and confident and blah blah blah. We should at least bring him in for an interview." That's the thing that people miss so much because people apply to hundreds of jobs and this is such a common story and you never hear anything. So having just one person at least be able to say, I know of James or I've talked to James or something. I don't have numbers, but like vastly increases the potential to get an interview. And at that point, it's all on how you do. But getting to the interview is a significant challenge.
yeah, the worst thing is when you apply to 20 or 30 places and you just get radio
Nothing.
silence,
Yep.
right? Like you don't get any feedback on like, was my resume a
Mhm.
problem? Am I not using the right mechanisms to get into the I think that qualitative work. So rather than spamming 100 different open
Yeah.
positions with your application, you can actually do some legwork. Like in the worst case, you at least get a human to tell you no and you can prod them and kind of figure out why. Um, do you have any advice like specific advice surrounding this idea of a coffee chat? Let's say I found a company maybe in my local area and I've done some research on LinkedIn. I found out who the hiring manager is, maybe who some of the people on the team are, maybe the HR person. How would you actually approach that problem of like getting someone to sit down with you for a few minutes?
Yeah, and sit down, like, this could also be virtual, especially nowadays, like, much more common probably for it to be virtual over Zoom than actually in person, but either way would be fantastic. I think most people assume a lot of people assume they're not good at several things innately. They're not a confident person, they're not good at networking, they're not extroverted, and they use that almost as an excuse to not do a request for a coffee chat, for example. Oh, that's not naturally me, I'm not naturally social, like, etcetera. And for all of those different characteristics, confidence, outgoingness, being able to have a conversation, those are practice skills that you can increase. And that confidence is one that I preach a lot with people looking to get that first job because most people aren't able to talk confidently about themselves and the things they've done. So then you won't be taken as seriously. If you can't sell yourself, nobody's going to buy or it's going to be harder. So the other aspect of that is like being social is a practice thing, and being social is like a very broad term. But what this translates to is like most people are nervous to just reach out to someone that they don't know, and they're nervous to have that conversation. I'm super social. I love people. I still am nervous to have conversations with people I've never met. It's awkward, but if you accept that and then you prepare and you write down questions to make sure that you have, if you blank out, you have something you can refer to. You do a little bit of research on that person. Saw you went to so and so university, saw you went through this program, saw you're a senior developer. What was that transition like? Do your research, have your notes, and just go based on that. But don't be afraid to send the request, because here's one side of this. Imagine if someone said, "Hey, you're super cool. I'd love to hear more about." Like, that's flattering, right? Like, most people enjoy sharing about their experiences and talking about themselves. Some people won't, and so you should just expect like X percentage of people will never respond. Totally fine. X number of people will respond and say, "Hey, I don't have time for this." Totally fine. Maybe probably more people than you expect would say, like, "Hey, I've got 15 minutes. I'm down to do this." And so you do that preparation of research of the company and them, like what are the things you want to know about the company and the interview process, et cetera. Bring those to the table and just have those be prepared, and also just embrace that like there probably will be some awkwardness. Like, I think this is one of something I'm very comfortable with, is owning awkwardness in situations like at conferences, for example, where like you see a group of people and you see one person on the outside and you're on the outside, so you jump in and then you bring them in and you just handle the awkwardness so you take it away from other people. Just expect that and understand that there's probably going to happen, and you can make it through and it's going to be okay.
I want to re-emphasize a point you just made that I think is really good. I'm sure you get this too. I get a lot of cold DMs from people either on Twitter or LinkedIn that says something along the lines of like, "Hey, can you help me get a job? Right? Can you help
Yeah.
me figure out how to get a job?" And 99% of the time, if the DM is literally just that, "Hey, please
Hmm.
help me find a job," uh, completely, I'm obviously going to ignore it. It goes right in the
Yep.
trash. Like I'm not, I don't have time to respond to this sort of thing. But almost every time, like probably more than 80% of the time, I get a DM that actually is personalized to me. And I don't
Yeah.
mean personalized like it just has my name on it. I mean personalized like clearly this person has done, like you said, some research on my past, right? They're like, "I saw you worked at this company. I think that's super interesting. I'd love to hear about that."
Yep.
Um, Anything you can do up front to show me, like you DMing me, right? To show me that you have actually done your share of the work rather than you're
Yep.
just DMing me and expecting me to do all the work. That goes so far in terms of like actually getting a response from people. Um, just showing that you
100%.
care enough to reach out in a
Yep.
way that saves everyone time. Um,
See, it's the equivalent too of like people reaching out for help from a programming perspective, and they say it doesn't work. What's wrong? And it's like there's a lot more that goes into this conversation for us to have it. And to your same point, like that's kind of an easy ignore. Like there's not much I can do with that. And so the more you took the approach of like tailored to them, 100% true. Also, the more specific you can be. And this is something I've learned from a just in my career. If I send something out to a team and say, "Hey, any feedback on this thing?" You often don't hear much, but if you say, "Hey, any specific feedback on this specific segment of the demo? Or does this make sense from this specific perspective?" Or just like narrowing the scope for people helps that a lot. And so if
yeah,
if
like
you
I said
say,
this, should I say this instead?
mhm,
Very
yeah,
binary.
something like
Yeah.
that, like more specific feedback, and combining like what you said and what I'm saying there, like tailoring it towards the person and also being specific of, "Hey, I see you have this background. I see you've done X, Y, and Z at this company. I'm specifically interested in applying at this company. Before I do, I'd love to talk to someone else to learn more about the culture, to more about the tools that you use and the workflow that you go through, et cetera, to see if it's a good fit for me." Those are pretty specific things that you're now giving them context as to what they can bring to the table, and not have this like overwhelming of the balance of, I want to help somebody. I don't know how to help the person because it's way too broad. And they help narrow that scope. So it's an easier conversation going forward.
I love that, especially the part, like you said, about being specific. Like maybe
Mhm.
I've been studying XYZ over the last 3 months and I've been building this
Yeah,
project.
exactly.
Is that applicable to this job? If not, how can I
Yeah.
change what I'm working on? Um, those kinds of questions will definitely get much better responses.
I feel like we should do an ebook of like just putting together common phrases like that that people can use in like coffee chat requests.
Yeah, that actually would, I mean,
Hmm.
just based on how many bad cold DMs I get, I imagine a lot of people would really appreciate that sort of
Yeah.
thing. Cool. Okay. So I want to reverse now back to your story. So you graduated with a CS degree. And you'd mentioned you went and applied at Microsoft. That wasn't successful. Where did you end up like breaking in to your first job in tech?
So it actually, both of those things are true, or both of these things are true. I was not successful, but then I started my career at Microsoft. So Microsoft recruited on campus. I hit it off with one of the recruiters that was there. He set me up with the interview for the software developer role. That's where I had the question of like how many lines of code, and I was like, I don't know. And I think they legitimately thought that was a bad look. And I still, again, to this day, that's one of the dumbest questions I think I've ever been asked. But um, Microsoft and other companies as well, and there internally they have three different responses: a hard no, a hard yes, like we want to make you an offer, and then somewhere in between where it's like we like you as a candidate for Microsoft, but not for this role. And
Mhm.
so honestly, I think they thought I wasn't technical enough for the software developer role. So then the recruiter said, "Hey, here's this other role." Flew out to DC, had in-person interviews for that all day, got rejected from that. And then he came back and said the third one, which is the developer evangelist or technical evangelist, which is still at Microsoft. So I still started my career there. And it was one of those things where in my interviews, I think I had talked about myself as a social person and my interest in learning mobile app development, which I did outside of class. And that was particularly something from a technical evangelist perspective that they were looking for, that they were looking for people to talk about. And they needed a combination of like technical experience and social and teaching. And I didn't quite have like teaching experience, but I had like a social wanna enjoying being around people aspect. So that was where I started my career, and really interestingly, like, I found myself very quickly within 6 months, like, giving presentations and talks to rooms full of developers that had been writing code for as long as I'd been alive. These developers had been writing code for 15, 20 years, and at this point, I'm 22 years old. So that was a really interesting, like, get thrown into the fire, but it was also really useful because most people fear they have nothing to bring to the table to an experienced developer audience. But what's important to know is you don't have to know more overall than your audience. You have to know more at that specific thing that you're presenting than your audience. So I was able to talk about modern application development with Windows, where Windows developers just hadn't gotten to that point, even though they'd been doing Windows software for 10 years. So that was kind of a good eye opener for me, I think, of like, even at a young age, I still had something to provide, assuming I find the right audience to talk to and to teach to.
I love that perspective, and I wanna take it even a little bit further in the sense that, in my experience, it's not even that you need to be more of an expert on that narrow band. It can be as simple as you have an interesting take or an interesting
Yeah.
opinion or a very
Yep.
specific experience with the technology,
Mhm.
that maybe even people that have been using it for 5 or 6 years, like, just never ran into that weird use case that you ended up,
Yep.
going down. Um, that sounds stressful as hell. I cannot, like, as a 22-year-old at Microsoft. I remember when I gave my first like brown bag presentation at lunch. This is a small tech company, like engineering team of 30,
Mhm.
and I was really, really stressed about it. I can't
Yep.
imagine giving talks at Microsoft. Were you like, were, how was that? What was going on in your head when you were doing that?
I think I think more like the probably the bigger part of the job was building community, like being out at events, meeting universities and high schools where I could do workshops and things like that. And a lot of the stuff I did was like pretty beginner stuff. So even though I was talking about like mobile app development before Windows, it was very introductory again because the audience just didn't have that specific experience. So I think I was able to combine topic and audience to take a lot of pressure off of myself, but at the same time, what that meant was I didn't have like coming out of college and then my 3 years at Microsoft, I didn't have real world developer experience. Like I worked on demos and I gave presentations, but very like introductory stuff. And I may be jumping ahead too far, but my next role was a software developer at FedEx back in Memphis. And there were several reasons why I moved and transitioned companies, but ended up doing software development at FedEx. And at that point in my career, I needed that like everyday, hands-on, real-world software development experience, which I think now makes me an infinitely better speaker, teacher, etc., because I have more actual developer experience to bring to the table. But again, going back to those presentations, combination of like introductory topic and audience, I feel like there wasn't a ton of pressure, but it you had to get really comfortable with being challenged by someone, and you have people that love to do that, like unfortunately, like just for fun. You have to be comfortable saying, "I don't know." And that's something that I think a lot of people or struggle with as well. Because in my mind, when I interview other people, the biggest red flag for me is you explain something confidently to me and it's wrong.
Mm.
Or you
ChatGPT
like,
style.
yeah, there you go. And or like you feel like you need to answer the question, so you try to make something up. A much better answer to me is I don't know, or I haven't experienced that yet. Because at this point in my career, I know that there's nothing I'm incapable of learning or understanding, right? Like I could do it. I just may or may not have the experience with it yet. So if I don't know an acronym or like something that other people are like, how do you not know that? Because I haven't needed it yet. Maybe I do now, or maybe I still don't, but I just haven't had that experience yet. It's not that I'm incapable of learning what that thing is.
I wrote an article, oh man, it's probably been 6 or 7 months ago now on this topic where I think there's a, like, delicate line, in the sand, between being, like, overly confident and or I should say
Yeah.
you need a certain amount of confidence in interviews, and you also need a certain
Yep.
amount of humility, right? There's this balance between confidence and humility. And I would argue that most junior developers that I've met need to err on the side of confidence. I think there's more imposter syndrome out there than like
Yeah.
braggarts on the junior side. On the senior side, it might
Yep.
be the other way around.
Yep.
Um, but it's just like you said. It's like if you know the answer, like you really should be confident in yourself and present it well as best you can. And if you don't know, you really should be comfortable saying you don't know because again, even senior engineers with like 10, 15 years experience. I've been interviewing for a new role at boot dev recently. I'm interviewing people with more experience than me, right? 15,
Hmm.
20 years. They
So
toss me an I don't know every once in a while. That's okay.
yeah. Yep. Yeah, I love that you brought up like people early on applying for roles and which side of the humility and confidence they maybe lack or have too much of. And so for context, I've taught 2 rounds of a boot camp called Launch Code, and this is we start at like 150 people, and we usually graduate like 50 or 60. It's meant to be like a big numbers thing, and then how many people make it through, and it's free curriculum for people, and it's a big involved and like engagement. Anyway, so I've taught 300 plus students through boot camps over the course of a few years. And consistently across the board, I always tell people, you need to be more confident. And again, this is a practice thing. You need to talk about yourself more confidently. Because I've almost never, in my experience of teaching bootcamp students, found someone who sounds conceited. Like in this transition period, they're starting at zero, right? Like they're starting, and this is not something we encounter much as adults, right? As kids, we learn new sports and we try to play the piano and we do all these things. As adults, we very rarely start from level 0. We're not used to doing that. We're not used to feeling like we're at the bottom of the barrel again. And almost I can't think of a person in my teaching career that I thought, "Hey, you need to tone it down." Like
Yeah.
you're not gonna you're gonna turn people off by the way you talk about the things you've done and the things you've learned. Yeah, practicing that confidence, and that really just comes down to practicing how you talk about yourself and the things you've done, and nitpicking with words that you use. The easy one that I talk about a lot is the word just. I just built this. I just learned how to do blah blah blah. And that diminishes what you've done, like very subtly, but it shows me that you don't have a lot of respect for what you've done. And that's something. One more aside, and then I'll kind of pause. I run a Discord community called Learn, Build, Teach. And this has been like a philosophy of mine for several years. Of we spend lots of time learning. As developers, we use what we learn to build stuff and then teach other people too. And it's a great way to continue to learn. And we have an event on every Friday morning, and it's called Wins of the Week. And it is specifically geared towards people celebrating their own wins because most of us don't spend enough time reflecting on the good things that we've done. Like most of us finish the week on a Friday and we reflect back and we're like, oh, I didn't do this. I didn't do that. I didn't get as far as I wanted to with this. And we rarely ever flip that to just appreciate, well, here's what I did do. And that's still a good thing. So that's what that time is specifically dedicated for, is because most people, including myself, most of the time, don't take the time to really appreciate the things we've learned, the things we've built, the things we've taught other people, going kind of full circle there. We just don't take the time to do that. And I think that can have a significant influence on how you talk about yourself and how you show up, specifically when it comes to interviews.
I think that's great. I think a lot of junior developers I don't know if this is like something overtly that a lot of people think about or if it's maybe more of just something subtle going on in the back of their minds. But um, when you interview at a company, you're never really going to be hired out of like sympathy. Like that
Oh,
doesn't
this
really
is a great
happen,
topic.
right?
Yes.
Like hiring managers and team members, like they're just not in
Doing you a
it
favor.
to do you a favor, right? They have
Yep,
20 applicants. Why would they do one applicant a favor? If they did,
yep,
you could almost argue that would be unethical, right? Because they're
yeah,
being sympathetic towards one candidate, not the other 19. So you really have to go into it with a mindset of what can I do for the company, right? Why am
yep,
I the right fit? And you, like you said, you really need to sell the fact that you can provide a lot of value to this team because the people interviewing you, they just want to know, are you going to make my life easy? Are you going to
yep.
pick up tickets and get them done? Or am I going to have to hold your hand and teach you every single step of the way? And it's really just a mindset thing, right? Selling yourself and the value that you can provide rather than as
Begging
something of
or
a
yeah,
charity case.
yeah. So my wife has recently, it's like 2 years ago now, gone through this transition where she had worked in hospitality all her life. Her mom has worked in hospitality all of her life. And my wife has always been very good at what she's done. Like always been recognized for that. Like people look to her for like, how do we solve this problem? And they like always come to her. She's always done so good. But the reality is like hospitality is very limiting and like how much money you make and how much vacation you get. Like the culture and the benefits are drastically different than being in tech. And so there's her last role before what she's in now, which I'll talk about in a second. Her last role was something she felt like she wasn't qualified for. And her perspective throughout that role was like, basically, I'm lucky to be here. And I like my biggest thing was like, they didn't hire you for that role because they felt bad for you. They hired you because regardless of what you perceive as your lack of experience, you were the best candidate for that job. And like now that you have a year of experience, I don't care that other people in a similar role have 10 more years experience than you do. Like you are better at your job than they are. And so from a negotiating perspective, like I don't care that they've been doing it for longer. You deserve more money and all these things than those people because you are that good at that job, regardless of how many years you've officially done it. So anyway, fast forward a little bit, and she transitioned into doing events and sponsorships for Auth0, which I'm actually wearing their shirt today. I used to work for Auth0. I no longer do. She still works there. Lots of my good friends are still there, like on her team that she works with. And overnight, going to Auth0, she tripled her salary. She gets unlimited vacation. We just had a baby. I don't think we've talked about this on the podcast. So she has 6 months of maternity leave, which is absolutely unheard of for anything in hospitality, especially. She gets stock options. Like she gets all these, I mean, everything about her career from a benefits perspective, from an appreciation perspective, from all these things just drastically changed overnight. And that was what I felt like she deserved the whole time that she just didn't quite see or know existed or maybe didn't have the confidence to be able to advocate for it. But she deserved it, right? That whole
Yeah.
time being in a different industry, that's what she deserved. And then just overnight, like finding the right opportunity at the right company, her life and my life now, like she's a big reason why I can be independent is because she has health insurance that's really good.
Yeah.
And so it's had a significant impact on both of us. But it one other thing I talk about also that aligns with that is like different companies will value you differently. Again, that was like across industries and companies, but within an industry, like different companies value you differently. You could be the same person, the same skill set, the same experience. You go to a different company and you could double your salary, right? Like because they
Yeah.
look at that value differently. They appreciate that value differently.
Yeah, different companies do different things, right? Your experience with some weird esoteric piece of technology might mean nothing to company A,
Yeah.
but yeah, company B will pay out the nose because they can't find
Yep.
people like you. I also want to circle back on that story from your wife because I think that's so applicable. It's not your job when you're applying at a company to filter yourself out. In
Yeah.
no way is that your responsibility, right? You're there to show up and and basically just explain to the hiring manager as best you can what you can provide and why you'd be a good fit. And if they don't think you'll be a good fit, like they'll
Right.
let you know, right?
Mhm.
You shouldn't be really in any way going out of your way to point out why you might not be a good fit.
Right.
Play
And
for your own
that's
team, right? They will filter you
yeah.
out.
Yeah. And that's what like A lot of people early on are scared to apply for roles that they don't feel like they meet all the requirements, and this is a common thing as well. Is like almost no one at any level for a given role meets all the quote unquote requirements like in the job description. So typical advice that I hear people give is if you meet 50% of those requirements, go ahead and apply because the candidate that meets all of those checkboxes most likely just doesn't really exist. And the reality is there's very little that you could put on a we want experience with X, Y, and Z that I couldn't learn. Right. Like I've been through enough in my career. I've learned enough in my career. I have enough experience in my career. I can learn whatever you want me to. And someone may come in and know that thing like already and be able to contribute faster, but I know I can learn it. So if I can bring these other skill sets to the table and I don't check one or two of these checkboxes, I know I can eventually. Like I know I'll get there. So that's one of the things that I hear myself included, but the community talk a lot is like apply for things before you feel like you're ready and specifically apply if you meet 50% of those items that are listed as requirements on a job description.
I couldn't agree more. Again, this is really top of mind because I'm going through the hiring process right now with a pool of candidates at Boot Dev. And actually, we've whittled down that pool now to one guy who we're like moving to the final stages of the interview process. And our stack is Go on the back end and Vue on the front end. And he's never done Vue. We had
Yep.
other people in the pool that have done Vue before. But
Right.
like it just kind of didn't end up being the deciding factor. Yeah, I'm with you there. If you think you
Yep.
could do the job, feel free to apply. If anything, you should be less concerned about like, oh no, I'm applying for a job I don't qualify for. They're gonna think I'm dumb. What you really should be concerned about is like, I'm going to waste my time applying, and like that's what you want to optimize for. Just trying to apply for positions that are as applicable as they can be.
Yep. And going back to the like lack of view experience, I don't know this candidate. We haven't talked secretly behind the scenes about this, but I can bet that that candidate has experience with some other framework. And so the more you progress in your career, you realize like these parallels between different things that are out there. And I really like this example. So I'll do a non-technical example first. Like if you look at cars, like I'm not a big car person, but I pay attention to makes and models and year. And if you look at like when Honda and Toyota both come out with new SUVs in 2025, those SUVs are going to look oddly similar to each other than you would think, considering they're two totally different companies. Like there's just these waves of things where they have these parallels and the body styles change almost like the exact same over the years. So you can see these parallels. And it's the same thing from a technical perspective. Me having experience with React and not Vue doesn't mean I don't understand what Vue does. Like I've used a framework and they solve similar problems. And whether it's Go or JavaScript or Java or .NET, like there's differences, but they solve similar problems. And these backend frameworks, they solve similar problems. So if you're able to have confidence to come into a conversation, if you were to interview me and I've never really used Vue, I could immediately draw parallels to things that I do have experience with. Like Vue, I would go and do the research. So don't take this as an actual interview answer, but like Vue 3 came out with like composability or like this new API, which kind of mimics functional components and hooks in React, right? So I can talk about my experience of being able to write composable code and bringing in hooks that I can reuse across components, have that experience in React, having never done it in Vue. And I can give you what I think would be a confident answer for you to know that I have the ability to come in and learn Vue to get the job done.
Yeah, the so many times in tech there is like a fundamental concept that like you as an engineer really need to understand in grok in order to be effective, and then it just so happens that that concept can be implemented in like 10 different technologies
Every
with
other,
10
yeah.
different programming languages, right?
Yep.
So many times I hear programmers like, no, like I'm learning javascript, I'm just going to learn only javascript because if I switch to python I'll be starting over. And I'm not saying everyone needs to switch to python, but you really shouldn't be too scared of dabbling in a few different things because the underlying concepts are so dang similar. Like
Yep.
you said, the syntax in programming is really the least of our problems. Why reactivity is important and how it makes us more productive, I would argue is more important to me when I'm interviewing a candidate. They can explain to me why we use React in the first place. That's more important to me than them knowing about some weird hook that I've never heard of that because they did a course and it went super deep on all these kind of random API surface area of React. That's not what I'm necessarily looking for. I'm looking for like conceptual knowledge because once you have that, everything else follows pretty quickly.
Yep. 100%. And that's where you can build your confidence, right? Like if you don't strategically approach that perceived gap going into an interview. If you put me on the spot and I haven't done any prep work for this to tackle this conversation, you say, "Hey, what's your experience with Vue?" I don't have a good answer. And like just an answer of I've never used Vue, not so good of an answer. But if I know that Vue is something that's written on there, and I do my research and I draw those parallels between React and Vue, and I read a couple of articles that kind of like compare them, and I watch a YouTube video to compare them just to get some high level parallels and understand that it's a front end framework. I now have confidence coming into that because I've done my research. It doesn't change me as a person. I'm just more prepared because I know that that question is coming, and I can. It's almost like if you have something that you're self conscious about, if you like laugh about it outwardly first, then somebody else making fun of it for you has no effect. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
you've already addressed it. And so I feel like you have the ability to just address all those things before going into an interview. And by the time you get the question or have to respond to something relevant to it, you're not making stuff up. You're not on the fly. Like all the things ideally that you talk about should be things that you've talked about before, or at least rehearsed, whether or not out loud, like in your head. Like that's where the research and the preparation comes in. Because as a speaker, like I go on a stage and you may think I'm the most confident person in the world, but the reality is like I prepared for this, right? Like this is stuff that I talk about every single day. This is stuff I show up and I could talk about in my sleep or like just waking up out of sleep. But if you put me on the spot to talk about something I don't know, I'm not going to be that same confident person because I don't know that thing. So this is where just like taking control of your preparation leads to a much more effective interview process and how you show up during those interviews.
That's a really good tactic, and I want to reiterate it and also apply it a little bit or tailor it towards my students and the listeners of this podcast on the back end side. I'll repeat it, and then you can make sure that I
Yeah.
understood properly. But imagine you're in an interview for a back end development position, and the question is basically, how much experience do you have with Python's Flask framework? Right. So you get hit with this question, and the answer is you haven't really done anything with Flask. But if you just say, oh, I haven't really done anything with Flask. Like that is a bad answer in that question or to that question. It's correct. It's truthful, but it's bad. You can still be truthful and have a good answer, which is something like, "Oh, Flask. I'm familiar with Flask. I've watched all these YouTube videos on Flask. I've done a ton of stuff in Go. And I like building REST APIs using the Go standard library. I'm very familiar with the syntax. Based on what I understand of Flask, it's very similar, right? I would maybe structure an endpoint like this in Go, and I can do the same thing in Flask. But like you want to relate the experience that you do have to the thing that you've heard of. And that's why I think it's just before you go into an interview, you should know what technologies they use so that you can do some surface level
Yeah.
research. But like you don't need to go build that whole Flask API before you go to the interview. You can just, if you understand the underlying fundamentals, the underlying concepts, you can give an answer that kind of shows off the experience that you do have and try to relate it as best you can.
Absolutely. 100%.
Cool.
That's
Okay. Glad
exactly
glad we're on the
what I
same
would do
page.
to approach that. Yeah.
Because I've been in the hiring position when someone has just been like, "Yeah, no, I don't know," and it's
And then
like
what do you do with that conversation after that?
yeah, like it's just awkward silence, and you just like,
Yeah.
okay, I guess I'll look down at my clipboard, like put a big no on that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the more you can twist the conversation to keep shining spotlights on the things you are good at, the better it's going to be for you. This has been so much fun, James. I really appreciate you taking the time. I think there's been a lot of great career insights that you've been able to share. Where can people find you online, find more of your content? You mentioned Learn, Build, Teach. Yeah, plug your online persona.
Yeah. So Learn Build Teach is the Discord community that I run. You can find a link to it at learnbuildteach.com. And then I am James Q Quick on most things. So I spend a lot of time on Twitter. YouTube is the biggest like content generator piece that I have. I also do TikTok. I've taken a few weeks off. I haven't done a TikTok in several weeks because of baby. But Twitter, TikTok, YouTube are the three big ones for me. So James Q Quick, and then personal website is James Q Quick as well, or
Awesome.
.com as well.
Sweet. I'll link all of those down in the show notes. Thanks again, James. Great having you on.